October 24th, 1944. 8:47 hours. Philippine Sea, 120 miles east of Samar Island. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, flagship of the Japanese Center Force, scanning the horizon through binoculars as his formation emerged from San Bernardino Strait. The morning was clear, visibility unlimited, sea state calm. Ahead, approximately 20 miles distant, American ships were visible against the dawn sky. Fleet carriers, the prize Kurita had been ordered to destroy, the vessels whose aircraft had been decimating Japanese positions across the Philippines, whose presence represented American naval dominance that had to be broken if Japan was to have any chance of prolonging the war. Confirm identification, Kurita ordered his intelligence officer, Commander Tonosuke Otani. Otani studied the distant ships through the battleship's high-power optics, consulting recognition manuals. Several seconds passed. Then, "Sir, those are not fleet carriers. Configuration suggests Casablanca-class escort carriers. Designation, CVE. Classification, auxiliary vessels." Kurita took the binoculars back, studying the ships more carefully. Otani was correct. The distinctive profiles were wrong for Essex or Midway-class fleet carriers. These were smaller vessels, approximately 500 feet long instead of 850 feet. Single elevator visible, not the multiple elevators of fleet carriers. Island superstructure positioned differently. Flight deck that appeared almost crude in construction. Escort carriers, Kurita repeated. Not primary fleet units. What are escort carriers doing in this operational area without main fleet support? It was a valid question. Escort carriers, CVEs, nicknamed combustible, vulnerable, expendable by their crews, were auxiliary vessels designed for secondary missions: convoy escort, anti-submarine patrol, ground support, aircraft transport. They carried 28 aircraft versus the 90-plus aircraft of fleet carriers. They could manage 19 knots maximum speed versus 33 knots for fleet carriers. They were built on merchant ship hulls using commercial construction methods. They were not vessels you deployed independently in contested waters against battleship-led surface forces. Yet there they were. 6 escort carriers, accompanied by destroyers and destroyer escorts, Taffy 3, as the Americans designated them, apparently conducting routine operations in waters that Center Force, with 4 battleships including Yamato, was about to enter. "Surface action," Kurita ordered. "All units, engage the carriers. This is a decisive opportunity." What followed would become the Battle off Samar, one of history's most dramatic naval engagements, where destroyers charged battleships in desperate defense, where escort carriers launched their handful of aircraft against overwhelming surface forces, where tactical desperation produced strategic salvation. But for Kurita, standing on Yamato's bridge as his battleships closed range on targets that should have been defenseless, a different realization was forming. A realization not about this battle, but about the war itself. "Commander Otani," Kurita said quietly, still watching the escort carriers maneuvering frantically as his battleships opened fire. "How many Casablanca-class carriers has American intelligence indicated are operational?" Otani consulted his briefing documents. Latest intelligence summary from Combined Fleet Headquarters indicates approximately 40 Casablanca-class CVEs commissioned, with additional units under construction. Total American escort carrier strength estimated at 70-80 vessels across all classes. 70 to 80 escort carriers. Auxiliary vessels, considered secondary combatants, produced in numbers that exceeded Japan's total carrier construction across all types throughout the entire war. Kurita did the mathematics silently. Japan had entered the war with 10 aircraft carriers, the most powerful carrier force in the world. In 3 years of intensive construction, Japan had built approximately 12 additional carriers of all types. Total carrier strength, December 1941 through October 1944. 22 vessels, including light carriers and converted cruisers. America had built 70 to 80 escort carriers alone. Not fleet carriers, auxiliary vessels. And intelligence reports indicated America simultaneously had operational approximately 15 fleet carriers, with more under construction at rates Japan couldn't match. The battle off Samar was still developing. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns were firing at targets 20 miles distant. Destroyers were maneuvering, launching torpedo attacks against his battleships. Aircraft from the escort carriers were strafing his formation despite having minimal armament. Some pilots reportedly making dry runs after exhausting ammunition, simply to distract Japanese gunners. But Kurita was no longer thinking tactically. He was thinking strategically, industrially, mathematically, and the mathematics were revealing something more decisive than any naval engagement. "Sir, we're achieving hits on the lead carrier," Otani reported. "She's on fire, losing speed." Kurita watched the stricken escort carrier, USS Gambier Bay, though he didn't know her name, take multiple hits and begin listing. A victory, tactical success. One American auxiliary carrier destroyed. But America had 70 more, and they were building them faster than Japan could sink them. These weren't irreplaceable fleet carriers whose loss would be strategic catastrophes. These were mass-produced auxiliary vessels that America apparently considered expendable enough to deploy in contested waters without hesitation. That realization, more than the battle's tactical outcome, more than whether center force broke through to the landing beaches, was what would haunt Kurita afterward. Not that Japan was fighting skilled opponents. Not that American technology was superior, but that America had industrialized naval warfare to the point where they could build auxiliary vessels in quantities that exceeded Japan's entire carrier construction program. 3 hours later, after Kurita had ordered center force to withdraw, a decision that would be debated and criticized for decades, he sat in Yamato's flag plot, writing his action report. He described the tactical situation, the engagement sequence, the decision to retire. But attached to the official report was a separate assessment, marked for senior leadership only. Encountered 6 Casablanca-class escort carriers operating independently in contested waters. American willingness to deploy auxiliary carriers in areas where fleet carriers would normally be considered at risk suggests either tactical desperation or strategic abundance. Given intelligence estimates of 70-plus American escort carriers operational, latter explanation appears more probable. Strategic assessment. American escort carrier production represents industrial capacity that Japan cannot match through any feasible construction program. These vessels, individually inferior to fleet carriers, are being produced at rates that make individual losses operationally acceptable. American naval doctrine appears to have evolved beyond fleet versus fleet engagement toward a model where auxiliary vessels handle secondary missions in sufficient numbers to allow fleet carriers to concentrate on primary offensive operations. If escort carriers can be deployed to contested waters in groups of 6 without apparent concern for their loss. American carrier strength is not measured in numbers of fleet carriers, but in total aviation-capable vessels. By this metric, American naval aviation capacity exceeds Japanese capacity by ratio that cannot be overcome through tactical excellence or operational skill. Kurita sealed the report, knowing it would reach combined fleet headquarters, would be read by Admiral Toyota, would perhaps make its way to Naval General Staff. Whether it would change anything was doubtful. Japan's strategic position was determined by industrial capacity, not by individual battles or tactical insights. But the escort carriers, those crude, slow, poorly armed auxiliary vessels that shouldn't have been in contested waters, had revealed something more devastating than any battle loss. They'd revealed that America was fighting a different kind of war, a war where losing 6 escort carriers would be tactically unfortunate, but strategically irrelevant, because 6 more were being completed that month. Japan was still thinking in terms of decisive naval engagements, careful husbanding of irreplaceable assets, tactical excellence compensating for numerical inferiority. America had moved beyond that paradigm entirely. They were industrializing naval power, building ships faster than they could be sunk, treating vessels as expendable components of a production system, rather than precious assets to be preserved. The mathematics of that industrial disparity, revealed in one encounter with 6 escort carriers that shouldn't have existed in such numbers, told Kurita everything about how the war would end. Not through any particular battle or campaign, but through simple arithmetic. America could build faster than Japan could destroy. The rest was just time. January 1942, Kaiser Shipyards, Vancouver, Washington. Henry J. Kaiser stood in a shipyard that didn't exist 6 months earlier, watching workers position the keel blocks for what would become USS Casablanca, CVE 55, the lead ship of a class that would redefine naval production. Kaiser was not a naval architect. He'd built roads, dams, and Liberty ships. He understood construction schedules, labor efficiency, and the industrial logic of mass production. He understood nothing about aircraft carriers except that the Navy said they needed them desperately and couldn't build them fast enough. "How long does it take to build a fleet carrier?" Kaiser had asked Admiral Ernest King during their initial meeting. 36 months from keel laying to commissioning," King replied. "Essex-class carriers require 900,000 man-hours, specialized steel, custom machinery, precision engineering throughout. We're building them as fast as physically possible." "What if we don't build fleet carriers?" Kaiser asked. "What if we build something simpler?" The concept emerged from pragmatic calculation rather than naval doctrine. Fleet carriers were optimized for fleet engagement. High speed, heavy armor, large aircraft capacity, sophisticated damage control. But most naval aviation missions didn't require fleet carrier capabilities. Anti-submarine patrol needed aircraft over convoys, not 33-knot sprint speed. Amphibious support needed close air support, not 90 aircraft strike packages. Training new pilots needed flight decks, not battle-worthy vessels. "Build me a flight deck on a merchant hull," Kaiser proposed. "Use commercial construction methods, standard materials, minimal customization. Accept reduced performance in exchange for production speed. How many missions could such a vessel perform adequately?" The Navy's initial assessment was skeptical. Escort carriers, CVEs, had been conceptualized in 1940, with the first conversions completed in 1941. But those were conversions of existing merchant vessels, not purpose-built production. The idea of manufacturing escort carriers from keel-up using assembly line methods seemed to violate fundamental principles of naval architecture. Kaiser proposed a production timeline that Navy engineers considered impossible. 90 days from keel laying to launch, 3 months to build an aircraft carrier versus 3 years for fleet carriers. "It won't be a real carrier," the skeptics argued. "It'll be a merchant ship with a flight deck. Slow, vulnerable, inadequate for fleet operations." "Then don't use them for fleet operations," Kaiser replied. "Use them for everything else. How many fleet carriers are currently assigned to convoy escort? To anti-submarine patrol? To training operations? Take those missions off fleet carriers, assign them to escort carriers, and your fleet carriers can focus on fleet engagement." The logic was industrial, not naval. But Admiral King, facing carrier shortages across every theater, approved mass production of Casablanca-class escort carriers with a contract that stunned naval construction experts. 50 vessels, to be built in less than 2 years. April 1943. Kaiser Vancouver Shipyard, Construction Statistics Review. The production data emerging from Casablanca-class construction violated every historical precedent for naval shipbuilding. USS Casablanca, CVE 55, keel laid, November 3, 1942, launched, April 5, 1943, commissioned, July 8, 1943, total construction time, 247 days, USS Liscum Bay, CVE 56. Keel laid, December 9, 1942, launched, April 19, 1943, commissioned, August 7, 1943, total construction time, 241 days, by the 6th vessel. Kaiser had optimized the process to 137 days from keel to launch. By the 15th vessel, the yard was completing one escort carrier every 14 days, launching a new carrier before the previous one had been commissioned. The construction methods were revolutionary by naval standards, blasphemous by traditional standards. Prefabrication, major sections, engine rooms, crew quarters, aircraft handling equipment were assembled in workshops, then lifted into the hull as complete units. Workers installed equipment in climate-controlled shops rather than cramped ship compartments. Standardization. Every Casablanca-class carrier was identical. Drawings, parts, procedures, training, all standardized across 50 vessels. A mechanic trained on CVE 55 could work on CVE 104 without retraining. Commercial construction. The hulls were built using merchant shipbuilding techniques, welded rather than riveted, with less complex watertight subdivision, using standard steel plate instead of specialized naval armor. The carriers were fragile compared to fleet carriers, but they could be built in 1/10 the time. Modular damage control. Rather than the sophisticated damage control systems of fleet carriers, Casablanca-class vessels used simple, accessible systems that semi-skilled crews could operate. Effectiveness was reduced, but training time dropped from months to weeks. The production statistics, compiled monthly, told a story that Japanese naval planners, reading intelligence summaries, couldn't fully process. April 1943. Production, fleet carriers commissioned. 0 escort carriers commissioned. 4 total American carrier aviation capacity added, 112 aircraft, 28 aircraft X-4 carriers, June 1943. Production, fleet carriers commissioned, 1 USS Essex, escort carriers commissioned, 6 total carrier aviation capacity added, 258 aircraft. By July 1943, America was commissioning escort carriers faster than Japan had built carriers of all types in the entire pre-war period. The Casablanca-class production run would ultimately reach 50 vessels, completed between July 1943 and July 1944, 1 year. 50 aircraft carriers. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant naval aviation strategists, reviewed these numbers in an intelligence summary and wrote a marginal note that was later found in Japanese naval archives. If these figures are accurate, carrier warfare as we conceived it has been rendered obsolete. The Americans are not building carriers to win decisive fleet engagements. They are building carriers as consumable assets, accepting that some will be lost while others continue operations. This is not naval doctrine. It is industrial warfare applied to sea power. September 1943. Japanese Naval General Staff, Tokyo. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, convened a strategy assessment meeting focused on a question that was becoming strategically decisive. How many aircraft carriers does America have? The intelligence officer, Captain Takeshi Naito, presented compiled data from multiple sources. American fleet carriers, CVCVL, Essex class, 7 operational, 10 plus under construction Independence class, light carriers. 9 operational total fleet light carriers, 16 operational, estimated 24 by end of 1944 American escort carriers, CVE, Casablanca class, 32 operational, 18 under construction, Bogue class, 11 operational Sangamon class, 4 operational other classes, 8 operational total escort carriers, 55 operational, estimated 100 plus by end of 1944. Combined total, Naito said. American carrier aviation capacity is approximately 1,800 operational aircraft currently, projected to exceed 3,000 aircraft by year-end 1944. This exceeds Japanese carrier aviation capacity by ratio of 3.1 currently, projected 5.1 by 1944. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, chief of the operations section, studied the figures with visible disbelief. These numbers suggest America is building more escort carriers, auxiliary vessels, than Japan has built carriers total throughout our entire naval history. Is this intelligence confirmed? Confirmed through multiple sources, Naito replied. Photographic reconnaissance of American shipyards, signals intelligence, prisoner interrogations. The escort carrier production rate is approximately 6 vessels monthly. 6 carriers per month, Fukudome repeated. We require 36 to 48 months to build a single fleet carrier. They're building 6 auxiliary carriers monthly. The production disparity is... He didn't finish the sentence. The production disparity was beyond any ratio that allowed meaningful tactical or operational response. This wasn't a situation where Japanese skill, training, or tactical excellence could compensate for numerical inferiority. This was industrial capacity operating at scales that made traditional naval calculations irrelevant. Admiral Nagano looked at the map showing projected American carrier deployments by theater. Pacific Theater, 40 carriers, 12 fleet, 28 escort. Atlantic Theater, 30 carriers, 4 fleet, 26 escort. Training Reserve, 25 carriers, 0 fleet, 25 escort. Under construction, 35 carriers, 12 fleet, 23 escort. They're using escort carriers for training, Nagano said quietly. They have so many carriers that they can dedicate entire vessels to pilot training, knowing that combat-ready carriers are being commissioned faster than pilots can be trained to fly from them. The strategic implication was devastating. Japan was carefully husbanding its limited carrier strength, avoiding losses, preserving assets for decisive battle. America was building carriers so rapidly that they could afford to use them for secondary missions, convoy escort, anti-submarine patrol, training, transport, while simultaneously maintaining fleet carrier strength for primary combat operations. What is our carrier construction rate? Nagano asked, though he knew the answer. Currently completing 1 carrier every 14-16 months, Fukudome replied. Taiho was commissioned in March after 32 months construction. Unryu is projected for commissioning in August after 28 months. We have funding approved for 6 additional fleet carriers, but construction timelines project completion in 1946 or 1947. 1946-1947, by which time, if current American production continued, the U.S. Navy would have 200-plus carriers operational. The mathematics made continued carrier warfare not difficult, but impossible. Japan was fighting an opponent who could lose 10 carriers and replace them within 2 months. Every Japanese carrier loss was irreplaceable within timeframes that mattered strategically. Nagano dismissed the meeting, but retained Fukudome for private discussion. The escort carrier numbers changed the strategic calculation fundamentally. We've been planning for decisive carrier battle, Kantai-Kessen doctrine, where our superior training and tactics defeat American numerical advantage. But if America has 100 carriers, decisive battle becomes meaningless. We could sink 20 carriers and they'd still have numerical superiority. And they're not risking fleet carriers in secondary operations, Fukudome added. The escort carriers handle convoy duty, anti-submarine patrol, amphibious support. Their fleet carriers are concentrated for offensive operations we cannot match numerically. They've created a naval strategy where auxiliary vessels handle defensive missions, while fleet units remain available for offense. It was the inverse of Japanese naval doctrine, which assigned fleet carriers to every critical mission because carrier strength was limited. Japanese fleet carriers escorted convoys, provided anti-submarine patrol, supported amphibious operations, and attempted fleet engagement, all simultaneously, because Japan lacked the carrier numbers to specialize. America had specialized through abundance: escort carriers for secondary missions, fleet carriers for primary operations, training carriers for pilot production. The system worked not through superior design, but through having enough carriers that individual losses or mission assignments didn't constrain operational flexibility. Can we respond? Nagano asked. Can we build escort carriers using simplified construction methods? Fukudome had anticipated the question. We lack the industrial capacity. Kaiser's shipyards are completing carriers using mass production techniques that require enormous infrastructure, steel production, machine tools, trained labor, transportation networks. Japan's industrial base cannot support mass production at American scales. We can build quality vessels slowly, or crude vessels slowly. We cannot build anything rapidly enough to match American production. The conclusion was unstated, but obvious. The carrier war was already lost, not through any battle or campaign, but through industrial mathematics that had been decided before the first shot was fired. America's industrial capacity had created naval power in quantities that made Japanese naval excellence operationally irrelevant. That escort carrier, the one Kurita would encounter off Samar a year later, represented not just one vessel but an entire production system. A system that could lose carriers and continue operations. A system that treated aircraft carriers as consumable war material rather than precious assets. A system that had industrialized naval power in ways Japanese doctrine had never conceived as possible. The war would continue for 2 more years. Battles would be fought, tactics would be tested, men would die. But the outcome had been determined by shipyard production schedules, not fleet engagements. By the time Kurita saw those 6 escort carriers off Samar, the mathematical reality had already been established. Japan was fighting an opponent who could build faster than Japan could destroy, and no amount of tactical skill could overcome that arithmetic. March 1944. USS Guadalcanal, CVE-60, Atlantic Ocean, 600 miles west of the Azores. Captain Daniel Gallery stood on Guadalcanal's bridge, watching his escort carrier's single aircraft elevator lift a Grumman TBF Avenger from the hangar deck. The operation was routine, launching aircraft for anti-submarine patrol, a mission Guadalcanal had performed continuously for 8 months. But the strategic implications of that routine were reshaping naval warfare in ways fleet carrier doctrine had never anticipated. Gallery's task group, Guadalcanal plus 4 destroyer escorts, was responsible for 100,000 square miles of Atlantic Ocean. Their mission: hunt German U-boats threatening convoy routes between America and Britain. It was unglamorous work, operationally critical but strategically invisible. No fleet engagements, no decisive battles, just continuous patrol operations searching for submarines that would sink merchant ships if left unopposed. Before escort carriers, this mission would have required either dedicating fleet carriers, vessels designed for fleet combat, to defensive patrol, or accepting that vast ocean areas remained unpatrolled and vulnerable. The mathematics were unfavorable either way. Fleet carriers assigned to convoy escort weren't available for offensive operations. Ocean areas without air cover experienced submarine attacks that destroyed 5–10% of merchant tonnage. The escort carrier solved this through industrial abundance rather than tactical excellence. Guadalcanal wasn't designed for fleet combat. Her 19-knot maximum speed was inadequate for keeping pace with fast carrier task forces. Her 28 aircraft capacity was insufficient for major strike operations. Her minimal armor made her vulnerable to surface engagement. But she could launch aircraft over 100,000 square miles of ocean, providing air cover that made U-boat operations nearly impossible. And America had built 50 Casablanca-class carriers specifically for this mission, plus additional escort carriers for other theaters. The vessels were individually limited, but collectively comprehensive. Every critical convoy route could have dedicated air cover. Every amphibious landing could have organic air support. Every strategic choke point could be continuously patrolled. Contact, the Combat Information Center reported. Radar contact, surface target bearing 085 degrees, range 12 miles, behavior consistent with U-boat attempting crash dive. Gallery-ordered aircraft launched. Within 8 minutes, 2 Avengers were airborne, vectored toward the contact. At 19 knots, Guadalcanal couldn't chase submarines, but her aircraft could, and that was sufficient. The U-boat, later identified as U-515, was caught on the surface, unable to dive before aircraft arrived. Depth charges bracketed her hull. She surfaced, crew abandoning ship. This was the 5th U-boat Guadalcanal's task group had destroyed in 8 months, not through superior technology or exceptional tactics, but through continuous presence. U-boats survived by operating in areas where air cover didn't exist. Escort carriers eliminated those areas systematically, making the Atlantic increasingly hostile to submarine operations. The strategic mathematics were decisive. In 1942, before escort carriers deployed in numbers, U-boats sank 6.2 million tons of Allied shipping. In 1943, with escort carriers covering critical convoy routes, U-boat successes dropped to 3.2 million tons. By 1944, with 40-plus escort carriers operating across the Atlantic, U-boat kills would drop below 1 million tons, while U-boat losses exceeded 240 vessels. Gallery wrote in his action report, "The escort carrier's value is not measured in fleet engagements, but in missions that fleet carriers cannot perform economically. One escort carrier, costing $6 million and requiring 900 crew, provides air cover over 100,000 square miles continuously. The alternative, dedicating a fleet carrier costing $70 million with 3,000 crew, is economically and operationally unsustainable. We have created a naval capability not through superior vessels, but through sufficient vessels." June 6, 1944. HMS Searcher, CVE 40, English Channel, 15 miles off Omaha Beach. The British escort carrier, one of 38 American-built escort carriers transferred to the Royal Navy under Lend-Lease, launched aircraft toward the Normandy beaches throughout D-Day. Her mission wasn't fleet combat or strategic strike. She provided close air support for ground forces, spotting for naval gunfire, interdicting German reinforcements attempting to reach the invasion beaches. Squadron leader James Pattison, flying a Supermarine Seafire from Searcher's deck, made his 7th sortie of the day, attacking German armor columns approaching from Caen. The mission was tactically straightforward: identify targets, coordinate with ground controllers, deliver ordnance, return to carrier for rearmament. No fleet carrier would be assigned to this mission. The task was too localized, too tactically specific, too continuous to justify fleet carrier deployment. But escort carriers could be assigned because America had built them in sufficient numbers that individual vessels could be dedicated to specific missions without constraining overall naval capability. Searcher wasn't defending against Japanese fleet carriers or escorting convoys. She was providing organic air support for amphibious operations, a mission that required carrier aviation but not fleet carrier capabilities. The Normandy invasion employed 9 escort carriers, 6 American, 3 British, providing continuous air cover over the landing beaches. They launched 200-plus sorties on D-Day alone, delivering close air support that traditional naval doctrine would have required dedicating multiple fleet carriers to provide. Instead, fleet carriers remained in the Pacific, conducting offensive operations against Japan, while escort carriers handled the European theater's requirements. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding Allied naval forces for Overlord, wrote in his assessment, "The availability of escort carriers has fundamentally altered amphibious doctrine. We can now provide organic air support for landing forces without diverting fleet carriers from primary missions. The carriers are individually limited, slow, lightly armed, vulnerable to air attack. But they are sufficient for the mission and available in numbers that make their loss acceptable. We are treating carriers as expendable assets in service of operational objectives, rather than preserving them as irreplaceable capital ships." This represented a doctrinal revolution that Japanese naval strategists, reading intelligence summaries, struggled to comprehend. Japanese doctrine treated every carrier as a precious asset to be preserved, risked only in decisive engagements where their loss might be strategically justified. American doctrine, enabled by industrial abundance, treated escort carriers as consumable assets whose loss was operationally acceptable if mission objectives were achieved. The mathematics cascaded through Pacific strategy. If America could dedicate 9 escort carriers to Normandy while maintaining 35-plus carriers in the Pacific, Japanese calculations about American carrier availability became meaningless. If individual carrier losses were strategically acceptable because replacement carriers were completing construction monthly, Japanese attempts to achieve attrition advantage through tactical excellence became futile. August 1944, USS Natoma Bay, CVE 62, Philippines Sea. Lieutenant Commander Richard Roby, Natoma Bay's Air Group commander, briefed his pilots on their mission for the upcoming invasion of Peleliu. The briefing focused not on fleet engagement or strategic strike, but on close air support procedures, coordination with ground controllers, and the continuous air patrol schedule that would see Natoma Bay's aircraft flying support missions, 12 hours daily for weeks. "We're not here to sink carriers," Roby told his pilots. "We're here to support Marines on the ground. Every sortie you fly keeps a Marine platoon alive. Every target you destroy prevents casualties. This isn't glamorous work. You won't be in Life magazine. But it's why escort carriers exist, to provide air support where and when it's needed, continuously, without requiring fleet carriers to perform missions beneath their capability." The Peleliu invasion would employ 18 escort carriers providing air support, while fleet carriers operated 400 miles north, conducting strikes against Japanese air bases in the Philippines. The operational division was clean: escort carriers for localized support, fleet carriers for strategic offense. Japan couldn't achieve this division because Japan lacked the carrier numbers to specialize. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commanding Japanese naval aviation in the Philippines, reviewed intelligence reports showing 18 American escort carriers supporting the Peleliu invasion while fleet carriers struck separately. His assessment, later captured in Japanese naval archives, reflected growing comprehension of what escort carrier production meant strategically. The Americans have created a naval aviation system where auxiliary vessels perform missions we require fleet carriers to execute. Their fleet carriers are therefore available for offensive operations in numbers we cannot match. When we commit carriers to local defense or support operations, those carriers are unavailable for fleet engagement. The Americans have no such constraint because they have built sufficient escort carriers that defensive missions do not consume fleet carrier availability. This is not a temporary advantage. The escort carriers being commissioned monthly represent permanent expansion of American naval aviation capacity. Even if we achieve tactical success against their fleet carriers, their escort carriers continue operating, and the missions those escort carriers perform, convoy escort, submarine patrol, amphibious support, training, are missions that must be performed regardless of fleet carrier availability. We calculated that sinking American fleet carriers would achieve strategic advantage. But if America has 100 carriers total, sinking 20 fleet carriers still leaves 80 carriers operational. The mathematics of attrition no longer favor any feasible Japanese strategy. October 1944. Combined Fleet Headquarters, Tokyo. Admiral Soemu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, reviewed operational plans for what would become the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The strategic situation was deteriorating. American forces had invaded the Philippines. Japanese naval forces had to respond or accept that the Philippines, and with them, access to oil from the Dutch East Indies, would be lost. The operational plan was desperate. Commit all remaining major surface combatants in coordinated attacks against American amphibious forces, accepting that many vessels would be lost, but calculating that destroying the invasion fleet might delay American advance sufficiently to negotiate better surrender terms. The intelligence summary accompanying the operational plan included American Naval Order of Battle. Toyota studied the numbers: American forces, Philippine theater, fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 8 escort carriers, 18 battleships, 12 cruisers, 24 destroyers, 140 plus. The escort carrier number drew his attention: 18 escort carriers assigned to a single operation, while intelligence indicated 50-plus additional escort carriers operating in other theaters. America was deploying escort carriers to the Philippines in numbers that exceeded Japan's total carrier construction throughout the entire war. "What missions are the escort carriers performing?" Toyota asked his operations officer. "Intelligence indicates mixed missions: close air support for ground forces, anti-submarine patrol, combat air patrol over amphibious forces, logistics transport. They appear to be functioning as mobile air bases, supporting ground operations, rather than engaging in fleet combat." Mobile air bases. That phrase captured what escort carriers represented strategically. They weren't warships in traditional doctrine. They were aviation platforms, deployed wherever air support was needed, providing capabilities that would otherwise require either land bases, which didn't exist in mid-ocean, or fleet carriers, which were too valuable to risk in secondary missions. Toyota made a notation on the intelligence summary, a note that Allied intelligence would find after the war when Japanese naval archives were captured. The escort carriers represent American industrial capacity made operational. Each vessel is individually inferior to our fleet carriers, but collectively, they provide aviation capability across the Pacific that we cannot contest. They are everywhere simultaneously. We cannot sink them faster than they are being built. This is not naval warfare as we understood it. This is industrial production applied to sea power, and we have no counter strategy. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would proceed. Japanese forces would achieve some tactical successes, sinking several escort carriers, including USS Gambier Bay during the Battle off Samar. But those losses would prove strategically meaningless. Gambier Bay was replaced within weeks by newly commissioned escort carriers. The missions she'd been performing continued without interruption. The industrial system that had produced her continued operating, commissioning additional carriers monthly. That single escort carrier sighting off Samar, the moment when Kurita saw 6 auxiliary vessels operating in contested waters, symbolized the entire strategic reality. America had built so many carriers that losing 6 was operationally acceptable. Japan couldn't sink them fast enough to matter, and the missions those carriers performed, unglamorous, tactically mundane, strategically decisive, were missions that were winning the war through accumulated effect rather than decisive battle. The escort carrier wasn't a superweapon. It was barely adequate for any individual mission. But adequacy in sufficient quantity had defeated excellence in limited numbers. That was the lesson Kurita recognized off Samar. That was the strategic reality Japanese naval doctrine had no framework to counter. The mathematics had decided the war before the first escort carrier was commissioned. Everything afterward was just arithmetic working itself out through battles whose outcomes were predetermined by shipyard production schedules. November 1944, Imperial Japanese Navy Staff College, Tokyo. Commander Toshikazu Omai stood before a classroom of senior naval officers, presenting what had been designated as a strategic assessment seminar, but felt increasingly like an autopsy. On the blackboard behind him, chalk diagrams illustrated American escort carrier deployment patterns across the Pacific. The numbers were so large they appeared to be errors until cross-referenced with multiple intelligence sources. As of November 1, 1944, Omai began. American escort carrier strength stands at 78 operational vessels across all theaters. An additional 22 vessels are undergoing trials or final fitting out, Total projected strength by year end, 100 escort carriers. He let the number settle. In the audience, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, recently returned from the Philippines, sat quietly, having requested permission to attend this briefing after his encounter off Samar. Beside him, Captain Tamichi Hara, one of Japan's most experienced destroyer commanders, was taking notes with the methodical precision of someone documenting their own strategic obsolescence. Omai continued. To place this in perspective, Japan has commissioned 25 carriers total since 1922, including fleet carriers, light carriers, and converted vessels. America has built 100 escort carriers alone in the past 2 years, while simultaneously constructing 24 fleet and light carriers. The production ratio is approximately 5.1 in their favor, and this ratio is increasing as their industrial mobilization reaches full capacity. But these are auxiliary vessels, an audience officer objected. Escort carriers cannot perform fleet combat missions. They lack the speed, armor, and aircraft capacity for engagement with our fleet carriers. That observation, Omai replied carefully, reflects precisely the doctrinal blind spot that has prevented us from understanding American naval strategy. You are correct that escort carriers cannot perform fleet combat effectively. But consider, what percentage of carrier operations actually require fleet carrier capabilities? He turned to the blackboard, writing a list. Missions requiring fleet carrier capabilities. Fleet engagement. Carrier versus carrier. Strategic strike against heavily defended targets. Deep penetration raids requiring extended range missions, not requiring fleet carrier capabilities. Anti-submarine patrol convoy escort, amphibious close air support, combat air patrol over invasion beaches, logistics transport, pilot training, aircraft ferry operations. Intelligence analysis suggests 70–80% of American carrier sorties are flown from escort carriers, performing missions in the second category. Meanwhile, their fleet carriers remain concentrated for offensive operations. We, by contrast, must use fleet carriers for all missions because we lack sufficient hulls to specialize. Kurita spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of recent experience. Off Samar, I encountered 6 escort carriers operating independently in contested waters, without fleet carrier support. Initially, I assumed this represented either tactical error or desperation, but reviewing the engagement afterward, I realized it represented something else: abundance. The Americans deployed those carriers knowing they might be lost. They accepted that risk because losing 6 escort carriers would not materially affect their overall carrier strength. We would never risk 6 fleet carriers in such a manner because we cannot replace them. The Americans can. They commission 6 new carriers monthly. The room absorbed this in silence. The implication was devastating. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized preservation of force, concentrating carriers for decisive battle, accepting tactical constraints to maintain strategic capability. American doctrine, enabled by industrial production, accepted tactical losses in exchange for operational freedom. There's a deeper strategic pattern, Omai continued. American escort carriers are not merely performing secondary missions. They are redefining what constitutes naval power. Consider the anti-submarine campaign in the Atlantic. He displayed a chart showing U-boat kill rates. U-boat losses, Atlantic Theater, 1942, 87 U-boats destroyed, 1943, 237 U-boats destroyed, 1944, John Ocht, 241 U-boats destroyed. The increase in 1943–1944 corresponds directly with escort carrier deployment. American hunter-killer groups, 1 escort carrier plus 4–6 destroyer escorts, patrol 100,000 square miles per group. With 40 such groups operating, they've created air coverage over virtually the entire Atlantic. U-boats can no longer operate safely anywhere. This is not achieved through technological superiority. Our submarines are competitive with American designs, It is achieved through continuous presence. The escort carriers are individually vulnerable, inadequately armed, and slow. But they are everywhere simultaneously, and that omnipresence makes submarine operations unsustainable. Captain Hara raised a question that captured the existential crisis facing Japanese naval strategy. If the Americans can produce carriers at rates that make individual losses acceptable, how do we achieve strategic advantage through attrition? Our doctrine assumes that sinking enemy carriers achieves cumulative advantage. But if they replace losses faster than we inflict them, attrition warfare becomes mathematically impossible. Omai had been considering this question for months. His answer reflected conclusions that the Naval General Staff was still unwilling to acknowledge publicly. We cannot achieve strategic advantage through attrition against an opponent whose production rates exceed our destruction rates. The mathematics are absolute. Even if we achieved a 2.1 kill ratio, sinking 2 American carriers for every Japanese carrier lost, we would still lose the cumulative exchange because they are building carriers faster than we can sink them. He displayed production timelines, carrier construction rates, average, Japanese fleet carrier, 32 months American fleet carrier, 18 months American escort carrier, 4 months. These numbers reveal why our strategy has failed. We planned for Kantai Kessen, decisive battle, where superior training and tactics would defeat American numerical superiority. But decisive battle requires that the enemy concentrate forces, offering an opportunity for engagement under favorable conditions. The Americans have refused to provide that opportunity. Instead, they have dispersed their carrier strength across the Pacific, using escort carriers for local operations, while concentrating fleet carriers for offensive strikes. We cannot force decisive battle because we cannot engage all their carriers simultaneously. And engaging portions of their strength achieves nothing because they replace losses from continuous production. Kurita interjected again, his tone carrying a finality that silenced the room. Off Samar, we had the tactical opportunity for decisive victory. 4 battleships, including Yamato, against 6 escort carriers with minimal protection. We achieved surprise. We had overwhelming firepower advantage, and the carriers were trapped against our force. It was the decisive engagement we had sought throughout the war. We sank 1 carrier, Gambier Bay, a tactical success. But intelligence reports indicate that Gambier Bay was replaced within 3 weeks by a newly commissioned escort carrier that took over her mission designation. The task group she had been assigned to continued operations without interruption. Her loss achieved nothing strategically. That realization, that we could achieve tactical success while accomplishing nothing strategically, is what convinced me to withdraw center force. Not because I feared tactical defeat, but because I recognized that tactical victory was strategically meaningless. We could have sunk all 6 carriers, and it would have changed nothing. 6 more would have been commissioned the following month. The room remained silent. Kurita had just articulated what many officers understood, but few would acknowledge. The war was being lost not through any particular battle or campaign, but through mathematics that made Japanese tactical excellence irrelevant. December 1944, Office of Naval Intelligence, Combined Fleet Headquarters. Captain Takeshi Naito compiled his final intelligence assessment of American carrier strength, a document that would be captured by Allied forces in 1945 and later analyzed by naval historians as evidence of Japanese strategic comprehension, too late to matter, but comprehensive in its recognition of defeat's mechanism. The assessment's opening section read, American carrier strength has evolved beyond traditional naval architecture categories. Attempting to evaluate their capabilities by counting fleet carriers versus escort carriers misunderstands their strategic approach. They have created a tiered carrier system where different vessel classes perform specialized missions, with no single mission constrained by lack of available hulls. Tier 1. Fleet carriers, Essex Midway class. Mission: offensive strikes, fleet engagement, deep penetration operations. Current strength, 15 operational, 9 under construction. These vessels represent American striking power against strategic targets and fleet units. Tier 2. Light Carriers, Independence Class. Mission: Fast Carrier Task Force Augmentation, Night Operations, Specialized Roles. Current strength, 9 operational. These vessels increase task force aircraft density without requiring full fleet carrier construction. Tier 3. Escort Carriers, Multiple Classes. Mission: All operations not requiring fleet carrier capabilities. Current strength, 78 operational, 44 under construction. These vessels have redefined what constitutes secondary missions by demonstrating that most naval aviation missions can be performed adequately with reduced capability vessels available in sufficient numbers. NITO's analysis then addressed the strategic implications. The escort carrier's significance is not measured by its combat capability, but by its liberation of fleet carriers from non-essential missions. Each escort carrier assigned to convoy duty, anti-submarine patrol, or amphibious support represents a fleet carrier mission that no longer constrains fleet carrier availability. The cumulative effect is that American fleet carriers operate with freedom of action Japanese carriers cannot achieve because Japanese carriers must perform all missions. Strategic assessment: American carrier strength should be measured not by fleet carrier numbers, but by total aviation capability deployed globally. By this metric, American carrier aviation exceeds Japanese capability by ratio of approximately 8.1 currently, projected to reach 12.1 by mid-1945. Most critically, this advantage is self-reinforcing. Escort carriers enable broader operational scope, which enables more aggressive fleet carrier employment, which achieves strategic results faster than Japanese responses can adapt. The Americans are not merely winning through numerical superiority, they are winning through a production and deployment system that makes our strategic planning obsolete as fast as we generate it. The assessment included a section that Allied intelligence analysts would later mark as particularly significant. Analysis of escort carrier losses provides insight into American operational doctrine. To date, Americans have lost 7 escort carriers to combat action: USS Gambier Bay, CVE 56, torpedoed November 1943 USS Block Island, CVE 21, torpedoed May 1944 USS Gambier Bay, CVE 73, sunk by surface action. October 1944 USS St. Low, CVE 63, kamikaze attack. October 1944 USS Amane Bay, CVE 79, kamikaze attack. January 1945, plus 2 additional losses projected by report date. Despite these losses, escort carrier operations have not been curtailed or restricted. Americans continue deploying escort carriers in contested waters, accepting loss rates of approximately 6% annually. This acceptance of losses indicates either reckless doctrine or, more likely, production rates that make 6% annual losses strategically acceptable. For comparison, Japanese doctrine considers any carrier loss a strategic setback requiring operational reassessment. American doctrine appears to treat escort carrier losses as acceptable overhead in a production system generating 50-plus carriers annually. The final section of NITO's assessment addressed the question that had haunted Japanese naval strategy since Midway. Strategic question: can Japan achieve victory through carrier aviation when the opponent produces carriers faster than we can destroy them? Assessment: no feasible Japanese strategy achieves victory under current production differentials. Even assuming optimistic scenarios where Japanese forces achieve 3.1 kill ratios against American carriers, American production rates replace losses within 60 to 90 days, while Japanese losses remain permanent. The carrier war has been decided by industrial capacity, not tactical excellence. Japanese naval aviation has performed with distinction, achieving tactical successes that should have been strategically significant. But those tactical successes have produced no strategic advantage because the Americans replace losses from continuous production, while Japanese losses are irreplaceable. Conclusion. The escort carrier symbolizes why Japan cannot win this war. It is not a sophisticated weapon. It is barely adequate for most missions. But adequacy and overwhelming quantity has defeated excellence in limited numbers. This is industrial warfare applied to naval power, and Japan has no counter-strategy. Naito filed the assessment in December 1944. By then, American escort carrier strength had reached 89 operational vessels. By war's end, in August 1945, the number would exceed 120. The assessment would be found in Japanese naval archives by Allied intelligence officers in September 1945, after the surrender. Admiral William Halsey, reading the captured document during occupation duty, would write a marginal note. Japanese understood what was happening. They recognized the strategic pattern. They simply couldn't do anything about it. We won this war in shipyards, not in battles. That single escort carrier sighting off Samar, the moment when Kurita saw 6 auxiliary vessels and recognized what they represented, had crystallized a strategic reality that Japanese intelligence analysis had been documenting for months. America had industrialized naval power. They had built carriers in quantities that made individual tactical excellence irrelevant. They had created a system where losing battles could still mean winning the war because production replaced losses faster than combat inflicted them. The mathematics had decided everything. Everything else was just time required for arithmetic to work itself out through battles whose outcomes were predetermined by shipyard production schedules established years earlier.